So let's wait for 6, and then a few minutes after that. We never start on time, as Jatinda knows, so people would be very disappointed if we start on time.
Yes,
I'm sure many
They'll be
will miss
shocked.
out.
They will be shocked.
So we'll wait for maybe 5 minutes or so after 6, and then start off. Shujit is supposed to join us. Our
Your new head of the department.
Yes, yes. So every time I see him, I become very happy.
Yes.
Because
yeah.
So we
also empathize with him.
Yes, that is why. That is why.
Yeah. You can imagine what he must be going through. But
Yes.
too early. He must be excited about becoming the head of the. This is the first time he has become the head of the department?
It is the first time, yes. He is excited, but he already knows what he is in because he has landed from the frying pan into the fire.
Okay.
Things are in a mess right now.
Yes.
So
we offer him our deepest sympathies, if not anything better than that. Sayantan? Yeah. How is Kavita? And
yes, she's fine.
Kavita,
She's fine.
Kunal. And any news of Shivaji?
No news of Shivajida at all.
Yeah, he has completely vanished.
Yes, he has renounced the public gaze.
Public sphere, yeah.
We tried to rope him in for some things recently, but he was adamant that he doesn't want to do any online thing. So Kavita Di and Kunalda are both fine. They are doing all right.
And Samantak?
He's good, but very, very busy with university work because, as you know, he takes on all kinds of NAC. He's the coordinator of the NAC effort, and that is just getting underway. So
So
he has his cup full.
His plate is full.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your campus is quiet? On the whole?
Yes. At this moment, campus is more or less quiet.
Right.
Because not much is happening on the campus, so.
Which is good news. And have you started working on the next issue of the JJCL?
Yes, just started. We have sent out the CFP. So the call for papers is out. I think there's a deadline sometime in April, probably. So once we come to the deadline, we will see and then take it forward.
Vrindan, what is Saraswati's surname? Saha? Oh, okay. She's right. Okay.
Shantanda,
Yes, Devashri.
could you please email me the link? I can't seem to log in through my computer.
Okay, I will email you the link right away.
Thank you. Good evening, sir. See you in a while. I'll just be visible in a while. Yeah.
My God.
Yes, Devashri, I've just sent it to you one more time. Oh, I think she's left. Fine.
Thank you, Shantanda. Yeah. Hello, sir. How are you? Good to see you. Shantanda is on mute. Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, Devashri.
Yeah.
I think Jatinda probably
Yes,
can't.
surely can't.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes,
I'll just put it up in the chat box.
yes.
Yeah.
We will just wait another couple of minutes and
Mhm.
then start off.
Shubhati, you should come. Shubhati, you should
Tiash, are we ready to start?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Jatinda, we will start off now.
Yes, yes.
You are ready? Okay. Okay, so good evening, everybody, and welcome to this. This is the second online talk in this series that is being organized by the Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. And we are privileged to have with us a long time friend of the Department of Comparative Literature, Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak. Jatinda to many of us. Professor Nayak retired as Professor of English from Utkal University in 2016. He is an eminent translator. He won the Katha Translation Award for 1997 and the Hutch Crossword Book Award in 2004. His English translations of Oriya classics have been published by the University of California Press, Oxford University Press, and Penguin Books, among others. He edits Marg Asia, a biannual journal which is brought out by the Center for Asian Studies, Bhubaneswar. At present, he is member of the English Advisory Board, Sahitya Academy. These are just some points to quote-unquote introduce Jatinder. But for many of us at Jadavpur, he is much, much more. He has been a mentor to a whole generation of comparatists at Jadavpur. We managed to get his expertise on many of our projects. So we are looking forward to hearing from Professor Nayak about the very interesting topic that he has chosen today relating to the translation of knowledge texts, which is not something that we often hear about. So it's an area where we are looking forward to knowing more about from Professor Nayak's talk. So I will request Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak to start off. Jatinder, over to you.
Thank you, Santan, for that generous introduction. I associate Jadavpur University with generosity because I have found there many very kind friends and very generous mentors. I see some of them here virtually. So I must confess that I was a little ambitious when I suggested this topic, but when I started thinking about it, I realized that I have bitten more than I can chew. This sounds very, very ambitious. Many people know little about this subject, and I know even less. But I think this is a subject that interests everyone, like Bollywood and cricket. Almost everyone in India, everyone in different states have an opinion on it. So the medium of instruction or medium of higher education, what should be the medium of instruction in higher education institutions, is a subject on which almost everyone in India has something to say and people become passionate about. And therefore I thought that I will present a few facts and then try to draw a few lessons from them. And these lessons may be very banal, but at least they will give us an opportunity to reflect upon a very serious crisis that is facing Indian education system and maybe comparative literature departments everywhere. Because if we slide into a depressingly monolingual world, what will happen to comparative literature? What will happen to knowledge? What will happen to democracy? What will happen to many other aspects of this very fragile world we live in? So I thought that I will take that as a starting point and try to talk about a particular experiment that took place in Odisha, was conducted in Odisha, the state which I know a little about, and try to broaden the scope of my discussion after I talk about that experiment and connect it with other similar experiments that are going on even now. So I will begin with referring to a particular news item that was published in the Mint in November, I think 20th of November. And this news tells us, this news story tells us that engineering in mother tongue in select national institutions from 2021, says Education Ministry. And as expected, this was greeted with outrage, shock, disbelief, and was dismissed as utopian, dismissed as too idealistic and totally impracticable, and then immediately, I think either before that or I get my dates wrong very often, so please don't take the dates I mentioned very seriously. But two directors of IIT, I can see a friend of mine who is a very distinguished professor in Bombay IIT among the audience. I'm a little nervous. So two directors of IIT immediately responded to this suggestion. The director of IIT Kharagpur gave a very encouraging, positive response. He was quite sympathetic to the idea. He thought that, yes, technology or science can be taught or should be taught through regional languages or through an Indian language. And the director of IIT Delhi was very hostile, very, very hostile to this very idea. And he said, the director of IIT Kharagpur had said that, well, students who learn about technology through their mother tongue acquire, again, conceptual clarity. That he said from his own experience. And this is as it should be. And then the director of Delhi IIT said that giving examples from Japan and Germany and all these countries, China, are all very good, but they do not take into account the special character of linguistic diversity in India. It will lead nowhere. This will be a very dangerous experiment, and it's too idealistic to really hold water. So I take that as a starting point. But I think that from time to time, this question of the medium of instruction in higher education crops up and is greeted with either disbelief or skepticism. But then I try to find out if this is a very recent phenomenon or it is embedded in a historical context. I found that there is a history, historical context to the whole question, or a historical context in which this question can be placed, and then it can be placed in proper perspective. So let's begin. I think the obvious starting point would be Macaulay, but I won't stop there for very long. We all know that Macaulay's minute led to the recognition of English as the medium of instruction, and the Orientalists got defeated, and the English, Sanskrit and Arabic as media of instruction were rejected, and vernaculars were accepted only at the level of primary education. And there was a mixture. After the Woods Dispatch, there was a mix of English and vernaculars in high schools, and higher education institutions used English as a medium of instruction. But this, I think, led to some reaction. It's not as if everybody took this line down. You know this very well. There was this resistance to colonization, resistance to colonial rule, political resistance to colonial rule soon acquired a cultural character. People started, when they resisted the processes of colonization, they also started talking about the cultural consequences of colonialism. So, for instance, my own state, Odisha, was the first state to be, a province to be recognized or formed on the basis of language. So throughout the 19th century, particularly in the latter half, the state, the language had to be enriched, the language had to be strengthened. So even poets and novelists like Radhanath Ray and Fakir Mohan, they started writing textbooks in Odia. They wrote textbooks on geography, textbooks on history, textbooks on mathematics or arithmetic. So producing knowledge texts in their own language became a matter of survival. And there are much more famous examples in the neighboring state, Bengal, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and Tagore write primers. So this investment in their own mother tongues, investments in their own local languages, is something that was constructed as a kind of cultural resistance to colonial rule. And the picture slowly changes as you move closer to the freedom struggle. That even in 1918, long 2 or 3 years before Gandhi comes to dominate the political landscape of India, one of the architects of modern Odisha, Pandit Gopabandhu Das, in 1918 writes in an essay that local language should be the medium of higher education everywhere in the country. If our country wants to acquire a national identity, it cannot do so if higher education is imparted through English. And he actually quotes Lord Chelmsford, the Vice Chancellor, the Viceroy of India, I think, who said that most of the Indian students are actually wasting a lot of their energy in memorizing entire texts. It's a travesty of education. So even in 1918, Gopabandhu Das was talking about the need for using local language or local languages in India as medium or media of higher education so that the country can acquire a national identity. Even before Gopabandhu Das says this, encyclopedias were being written in Bengal, for instance, the famous Encyclopedia 1911. And if I remember right, these were considered means of methods of enriching and consolidating and strengthening Indian indigenous languages in India. And if I remember right, I may be wrong, Gandhiji went to meet N.N. Basu when he fell ill in Kolkata. So Gopabandhu Das writes in one of his essays that Odias should emulate the example of N.N. Basu. Young men should come forward to compile encyclopedias, because in encyclopedias, language is used as a vehicle of knowledge. So already, I think a climate had been created in which we think of language as a vehicle of knowledge, and we want to develop, fashion regional languages or Indian languages as languages of knowledge. Because one important thing that colonialism had done to Indian languages is to destroy their confidence as languages of knowledge. Nobody thought that you could write about economics, you could write about psychology, you could write about physics in Indian languages. In order to acquire knowledge about these subjects, you have to gain mastery over English as a language of communication or means of communication. And increasingly throughout the freedom struggle, this question kept cropping up. In 1921, when Gandhi came to Cuttack in March 1921, Gandhi came to Cuttack on the 21st, I think. And there he said that, well, we have been crippled by English. And when somebody said that you have acquired an English education, you are a trained barrister, you have spent so many years in Britain, so why did you learn English and you are denying us the opportunity to learn this language, which would bring us jobs? So Gandhi gave a very interesting answer, and Tagore took him to task for that. He said that, well, did Chaitanya know English? Did Sankara know English? Had I not known English, had I studied everything through an Indian language, I would have been a much greater human being. So Tagore took Gandhi to task, berated him for what he thought was xenophobia. So this question was a very, very charged one. Everybody was worrying about what should be the language of knowledge, English or some Indian language, English or one of the Indian languages. So this question kept pestering. People were pestered by this question, bothered by that question. And so I think this question didn't go away. And we all know what happened after that, and after independence, and this what should be the official language of India, what should be the national language of India, and then the Hindi versus South India. The Hindi speaking North and South India were at loggerheads with each other, the language agitations. So this question remained unresolved. But suppose we go to 1947 and the years after that. The first, I think, education report was prepared under the presidency of Dr. Radhakrishnan. I don't think it deals with this question, language. I may be wrong, but as far as I remember, UGC was the product of Radhakrishnan Commission, and they primarily focused upon universities. They didn't take a comprehensive look at the situation. When we come to, say, 1964, the government of India appointed Kothari Commission to present to prepare a comprehensive report on education. And here, I think the Kothari Commission took a very ambitious initiative. There are many things. I think it was prepared by a visionary, what's his name? I forgot. J.P. Nayak, Maharashtra. So, an educationist from Maharashtra, was the secretary of the commission, and the whole report is largely his handiwork. And J.P. Nayak, I always refer to the opening sentence of this report, because no other education report is written with such passion. So the opening sentence, or the sentence with which Kotha 3-volume Kothari Commission report opens, reads something like this: the destiny of India is being shaped in her classroom. So this report, of course, took education very seriously, and J.P. Nayak was a visionary. So there are many other aspects of this report, and I haven't really gone through every aspect of it. I think it made a revolutionary recommendation. Kothari Commission report dwells on the question of language with an intensity, with a seriousness that we don't find in any other report. And for the first time, perhaps in independent India, the government acted on its recommendations, and it had far-reaching consequences. So one very important aspect of the report is its views on education. Language, the medium of higher education, not the medium of school education. It makes it very clear that unless higher education is imparted through regional languages, democracy in India will not strike very deep roots. It even goes further. It says that a secular and scientific India, democratic India, will be possible only if education is imparted in higher education institutions through regional languages. But it's not anti-English. It's English will continue, but it will continue as a library language. So these days, many linguists don't like this expression, library language. There's no language is a library. I'm not a linguist, so I won't go into that. But at least Kothari Commission presents English as a very useful library language. And it doesn't want English, only English to be that language. He said, okay, it can dominate, it's very useful. We have a colonial legacy, we know this language, but we should also pick up another or a number of other library languages. And the report suggests Russian. And since the report is written in or prepared in 64, 66, you can sense the shadow, or you can see the shadow of the Cold War, that India at that point of time was very close to USSR, and Russian was considered as another very important library language. And in the report you have many positive, or you can say many remarks which are very, very appreciative of the development that has taken place in USSR, that we should follow USSR as an example, where students don't have to pay fees. Poor students will not be prevented from receiving education because they are poor. They are unable to pay their fees. And again, Russian is an important language. So you can see that there is this great ambition, this idea that Indian languages must be strengthened. They must be converted to or transformed into languages of knowledge. And there is this very inspiring, this very touching belief that if you do so, we will have a strong, democratic, secular society which will benefit from scientific knowledge. So this report, in which such important recommendations were made, which are very, very significant considering the context, very, very bold, very daring recommendations. In 1968, the Parliament, and Jadavpur University has something to do with it, because Dr. Tribhuda Sen at that time was the Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University and was a member of this commission. I'm sure some of you know this. So In 1968, I think Dr. Triguna Sen was already the education minister when the report was submitted to the ministry. Mr. Justice Chagla was the education minister. Then perhaps Dr. Triguna Sen took over, and Dr. Triguna Sen gets this report and its recommendations accepted in the parliament. So the recommendations are accepted in the parliament in 1968. And there are some immediate consequences of this, of the parliament accepting this report. In Odisha, the textbook bureau or Bureau of Production of Textbooks was set up in 1970. And I think in other states, this is, I think I would like to find out whether these things also happened in other states, whether textbook bureaus functioned in other states along the lines they functioned in Odisha. I'm sure there must have been textbook bureaus in other states because it. So 1970, textbook bureau gets established in Odisha. It has a mandate to produce higher education textbooks in Odia. So from 1971, between 1972 to 1981, more than 300 textbooks were published by the textbook bureau. And most of these were translated from English textbooks, which were in use in British and American universities. In geology, in physics, accounting, climatology, huge books, fat books. Some books run into 1,100 pages. So these very fat books were translated into Odia by very eminent academics. Plato's philosophy Republic was translated by a professor of philosophy in Utkal University, was a student of A.J. Iyer. Or the Machiavelli's Prince was translated by a legendary professor of political science who had done his PhD from Berlin. So it's not as so. It was a very ambitious initiative, and all these books were written by or translated by very important academics who were very distinguished in their fields, who had achieved great distinction in their chosen spheres of activity, and more than 300 books, and most of them were translations of textbooks written in English. Some of them were also written; they were not translations. But a majority of these 300 books, or more than 300 books, happen to be translations. And for instance, Kafka's Castle was translated. Scarlet Letter's Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter was translated into Odia. And Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballad, Bork's Sublime, the essay on Sublime, the beautiful and the sublime. All these were, and there was an encyclopedia on world literature, Vishwa Sahitya Parichaya, that was also written by two of my teachers. So you could see that this was a very, and the money was provided by the central government. So money came from the central government. The textbook bureau published more than 300 books in the space of only a decade or 10 years. And then they went on doing so until well into the 1980s and 1990s. So by 2016, if you look at the report of the textbook bureau, they had published 650 books in Odia. And I see that some of these books went through to one or two editions, but most of the books went through only one edition. So they present a depressing picture that they were supposed to be taught in BA classes, BSc classes, maybe MSc classes, and they were reviewed by other good academics. They are published on cheap paper, printed on cheap paper, because the cost had to be kept low. They had to be made affordable to students, most of whom were poor. But After all this, each one of these texts were printed. The print run was maybe 1,000, 2,000, like that. So all this, so one should think that now Odia should emerge as a language of knowledge. Now people can read about physics, people can read about geology, climatology, they can learn things about statistics, accounting, literary criticism through their own language. Because the assumption underlying Kothari Commission's report was that if you access knowledge through your own local language, and that was also the view of Gandhi, that was the view of Gopabandhu Das, and many other great educationists of India. Perhaps that was what many anti-colonial freedom fighters thought. Did it really happen? Why did this ambitious project lead nowhere? Why did this fail? That's why I titled my talk, Lessons, Translation of Knowledge Texts and the Lessons from a Failed Experiment in Odisha. I think that was a failure. Because if you go, most of these texts are no longer available. And when they were available, I doubt if anyone read them. So I will go into the causes later, but I think the story isn't finished yet. I think this experiment with circulating, prescribing texts which are translated into Odia from English, that story hasn't come to an end yet. I think the story continues to unfold in many unsuspected and interesting ways. We haven't really buried or laid that question to rest. This question of relating to what should be the medium of higher education has not been laid to rest. It keeps bothering us. It keeps resurfacing. And I gave you the example of one very ambitious experiment, and I'm sure such experiments were conducted in other parts of the country. 14 languages, they say. In 14 languages, they conducted this experiment. So there must be 14 textbook bureaus. I don't know. I would like to know from whether at least whether this happened in Bengal or not. I will go into why this whole experiment failed. But before that, I'll talk about how the story continues, how the story goes on unfolding in very interesting ways. In 2006, we have something called the National Translation Mission. First, you had the National Knowledge Commission. Now, we have the National Translation Mission. And again, you see most of the ideas that you came across in the Kothari Commission on the chapter on language, the medium of higher education, which language should be the medium of higher education, most of these questions are revisited. But there is a huge difference now. If you go through the mandate of the statement, the mission and vision of National Translation Mission, they are very similar to what is said in the Kothari Commission, but with important differences. National Translation Mission no longer talks about Indian languages as media of higher education. They no longer talk about that. They talk about, the National Translation Mission talks about translating knowledge texts. And it would facilitate higher education. It would facilitate higher education by rendering texts written in English or texts written in other languages, foreign languages, accessible to students and academics. So you have a very different goal now. National Translation Mission sets a very different goal. It doesn't talk about what should be the medium of instruction or the medium through which language should be the medium of instruction at the higher education institutes. It talks about strengthening Indian languages through translation. And it says something very interesting. It says the first step, the goal, the translation of knowledge texts into Indian languages is the first step towards establishing translation as an industry. So they are no longer interested in introducing Indian languages in IITs or in universities or in higher education departments. They are now, they recognize a translation as an industry. They want to establish translation as an industry. They think that there is a recognized demand for translation in the country, and they translate as many knowledge texts as possible into, you know that its head office is in Central Institute of Indian Languages. National Translation Mission has undertaken the translation into Indian languages. So many knowledge texts in the now they say 22 Indian languages and the languages in the 8th schedule. So the scope has widened. The scope has become grown broader. But the goal is no longer making Indian languages the chosen medium of higher education, medium of instruction in higher education institutions. They're talking about markets. They're talking about strengthening Indian languages by through translation. That if many knowledge texts are translated into a particular language, the language will become very strong. The language will be enriched. And once a language is enriched, this will facilitate higher education, but they don't tell us how. If teaching won't be conducted through that language. And they also talk about how translating knowledge texts, making knowledge available in Indian languages will create a knowledge society. When Kothari Commission was preparing its report, this buzzword hadn't been very popular. Nobody talked about knowledge society those days, but by 2006, knowledge society has become a buzzword. Everybody talked about knowledge society. That's why we had knowledge commission. So they would create all these translated texts or knowledge text translated into Indian languages will create an inclusive knowledge society, an inclusive democratic knowledge society. Earlier, Kothari Commission also talked about regional language as a medium of education, creating or laying the foundation for an inclusive and democratic society which will be enriched by or which will be informed by scientific knowledge, and it will democratize knowledge so that people won't be excluded from knowledge systems. Now, the National Translation Mission talks about creating an inclusive knowledge society, but it doesn't refer to, doesn't mention, doesn't insist on Indian languages becoming media of instruction in higher education institutions. In fact, we no longer talk about medium. For instance, recently, the government of Andhra Pradesh decided that all primary schools, all government schools should be English medium schools. Nobody protested. In fact, the argument of the chief minister is that this is exactly what the parents want. And in India, there was no debate about that. Someone has filed a lawsuit against this move in the Supreme Court, and I don't think the verdict is out yet. But at school level, we have already moved decisively towards monolingual education. So in National Translation Mission, they are talking about translation. They are talking about translation strengthening higher education, facilitating higher education, but it doesn't talk about or omits to speak on, omits to refer to the medium of instruction in higher education institutions. So this question crops up again after 10 years, after 20, nearly 15 years, with the new education policy, 2020. And let me go back to the news item that I came across, that now they're attempting to introduce teaching of technology in local languages in some NITs and IITs, and there is already a storm of outrage against that. Some people support it, but most people consider it utopian and quixotic. And all kinds of arguments are given that this is simply not possible. And I have given you a couple of arguments advanced by the IIT director, director of the IIT Delhi. But there will be many more arguments against that, and people don't think that it's simply possible. Even in ODI, I mean, sometimes we say that we argue against English using English, but sometimes you can argue against your mother tongue using your mother tongue. So this peculiar situation has arisen that people who speak a local language would like to abandon it, and they have no faith in their languages as languages of knowledge. Examples from Israel, examples from Japan and China, I don't think convinces them. These examples don't convince them. Because very often we use diversity against diversity. We first say that we have a rich linguistic diversity in India. We should cherish all these languages. And when it comes to using one of these languages or some of these languages as media of instruction, we use diversity against diversity. So that we said, no, only one language. And you see this very interesting example of the South. In the South, for instance, they opposed incursion of Hindi or imposition of Hindi. But that didn't mean that they love their own languages and would like to transform them into languages of knowledge. They promoted English. So ultimately, English got strengthened, not Tamil, Telugu, or Kannada. So whatever steps they took appeared very, very utopian, quixotic. Ultimately, in the conflict between Hindi and the southern languages lost, Hindi gained. So to some extent, Hindi has emerged as a reasonably powerful language of knowledge, whereas Eastern languages, southern languages, they opposed the imposition of Hindi and weakened their own languages by sticking to or clinging to English. So this is a very peculiar situation. The new education policy has revived this question, and there will be debates, there will be skepticism. So now I will talk about the lessons, what lessons were learned. I have already given you a picture of the language or the different language, the different questions about language, which language should be the medium of instruction. So the three stages, I think, we began with Macaulay, and then during the colonial, anti-colonial resistance, we started thinking of Indian languages as languages, developing them as languages of knowledge, because we thought that unless we develop Indian languages as languages of knowledge, we cannot counter, combat the cultural onslaught or the cultural assault of colonialism. And then after independence, Kothari Commission made a spirited attempt at making regional languages or local languages as medium of instruction at higher education institutions. And I told you about the initiatives that were taken by the government, the money that was invested in. These textbook bureaus exist. Lots of books have been published in local languages, but either they have been destroyed by white arms or they have been lost or nobody bothers about them. It's extremely difficult to find those 200 or 300 books anymore. And finally, National Translation Mission changes the terms of engagement. It no longer talks about language as a medium. Any language you do, preferably English. So I think the assumption is that English would continue to be the medium of instruction in higher education, but they hope against hope that all these thousands of knowledge texts translated into Indian languages, 22 Indian languages and some languages which belong to the 8th schedule, will somehow facilitate higher education and create an inclusive knowledge society. What it would include and what knowledge will be acquired remains very unclear. So now I'll talk about the lessons. What lessons can we learn from this failed experiment in Odisha and perhaps elsewhere in the country? But since I know something about Odisha, I focused on Odisha, chose to focus on Odisha. I think the first lesson is that we didn't learn any lessons. We continue to bring out these translations which no one reads. The other lesson which I didn't learn is that these translations were unreadable. Most of these translations were done by very eminent scholars, but they were not student friendly. They simply translated these texts, and they were perfunctorily reviewed, and they were not field tested, so no one read them before they were prescribed. So sometimes the translations were more difficult than the originals. So suppose I want to read Republic, in Odia translation, I would find it more difficult than the English translation of Plato's Republic. Machiavelli's English translation of The Prince would be far more easy to access than the Odia translation. So these translations were unreadable, very difficult. Nobody really bothered about ensuring their readability. The other thing is that they were field tested. They should have been field tested, like they should have been taught to experimental groups of students, and feedback should have been taken from teachers and students, but we never involved students there. We thought that we are great scholars, we have translated these, and now they would automatically facilitate higher education. The third lesson is, I think they forgot about making local languages languages of opportunity. It's all very well to talk about transforming Indian languages into languages of knowledge. Sounds very good, looks very good on paper. But unless languages are also made languages of opportunity, people won't be convinced that they should study everything in their own language. If that own language happens to be a language that is despised by the employers, then they won't be interested in it. They would speak that language, but won't like to receive instruction or education through that language. I'll give you an example from an autobiography written by an Odia scholar. He was a passionate, impassioned, I think, advocate of mother tongue education. So he asked his daughter and his niece to do their BA through in the Odia medium. So they passed their BA, and when they applied for jobs, everywhere they were silently rejected, not officially, not formally. They're silently rejected. So within Odisha, someone who has done a BA in the Odia medium is suddenly finds herself unemployable. So this kind of anomaly, this is the situation which turned many students off books written in Odia and the initiative to appear for their exams or receive their instruction through their mother tongue. So this we didn't. And the fourth or fifth lesson that we should take from this is that bilingualism, what is dying is bilingualism or multilingualism. When we think of translating all these texts, when we think of a student reading or receiving education through a particular language, we should also make sure that they have access to another language, such as English. So when somebody knows only Odia and nothing else, somebody knows who knows only Telugu and nothing else, I think we are eroding his bilingual identity, which is very important in India. We're all reflexively bilingual or multilingual, and that used to be a great advantage. So if you focus on regional language as a medium of instruction to the exclusion of all other languages, a kind of impoverishment also takes place. And that has also rendered education through the medium of regional languages extremely unattractive. And I think we have been extremely dependent on, helplessly dependent on the texts in a world which is now transformed by technology. For instance, think of the Indian Parliament. People from so many different linguistic groups or communities go there, and some of them decide to speak in Tamil or Telugu or Punjabi, and then the technology available there, the tools of translation available there, enable all the others to listen to that MP, because everything is translated instantly, simultaneously into other languages. But in higher education institutions, we have never bothered about applying these technological tools. Tools of technology are available in the parliament, but in IITs they won't be available. We won't bother about simultaneous translation in an IIT or university classroom. So we have also been extremely text-based. I think only in terms of textbooks, and textbooks, as we all know, are extremely boring. The printed word is increasingly becoming more and more unacceptable to a new generation. So had we taken the help of technological tools or translation tools and made them part of our pedagogy, I think we could have gone some distance, moved closer to the goal of making at least some progress towards, or making some progress towards making regional languages the medium of higher education. So we didn't experiment with that. We always thought that, well, we can just translating texts into Indian languages is enough. So these are some of the lessons that I can think of, the lessons which you actually didn't learn. So I should say that these are the lessons we didn't learn. So we go on setting up one commission after another, then move away from tough, thorny questions and try to, I think, look for shortcuts. The last lesson that we should keep in mind, or I think we should learn from the whole experiment, or the series of experiments India has conducted with, our nation has conducted with transforming Indian languages into languages of knowledge, language of opportunity, is that these questions will not go away. There is always this feeling, there is always this belief that somehow linguistic diversity will die a natural death, and one day India will be a monolingual nation. All these Indian languages will become languages of entertainment, and we can pursue our educational goals through the medium of a single language. I don't think that will happen. I think once Professor Amlan Datta had made this very resonant observation that when we move away from our local languages, our mother tongues, a vacuum is created. Perhaps I'm misquoting him, distorting what he said, but he said something like this, that when we move away, drift away from our local languages and embrace a language which is totally alien to, I think, millions of Indians, or a majority of Indians, the vacuum will be filled with violence. So we should beware of that. We should worry about that. Linguistic diversity doesn't disappear overnight just because, and I already gave you the example of, in the midst of all this, how Hindi has succeeded in becoming a language of knowledge, language of opportunity to some extent. In civil service exams, you see lots of students from the Hindi belt writing their answers in Hindi, but no one from Odisha or Bengal or other parts of the country answer their questions in their own local languages. So one linguistic community is now marching ahead. If you look at the initiatives they take to make their language a language of knowledge. Everything that's written in English gets quickly translated into very readable Hindi, and they have been able to express themselves on very academic questions, very complex academic questions, without using a word of English in the public sphere, something that we have not been able to do. So the picture is not a very simple one. There are layers and layers which we must take notice of, or must take into account. And then these are the lessons that I could think of, and I think I should stop here. And it would be wonderful if there are a few questions which I'll try not to answer if I can't answer them, but I would like to listen to them. Okay, so Santana, do you have 10 minutes?
Yes, of course.
Is it? I hope it's not a 1 hour and a half lecture.
No. This is
No,
fine.
thank God.
This is
Thank.
fine.
So it's all right. I was worried. So if I made sense, if what I said made sense to some of the participants, then I would love to take a few questions.
Yes. I think Jatinder,
Ask a question.
yes, I'll just come to you. I just wanted to say, Jatinder, there are a couple of questions that have been keyed into the chat box. So
Okay.
I'll just read them out and
Yeah.
you can answer them. And my request is, if there are any other questions, please do feel free to key them into the chat box. Okay, Shuparna Mundol has a question. She says, thank you for the enriching talk, sir. My question is, how do you see untranslatability in the context of knowledge texts? I think that has some relevance on that point that you were mentioning about how so many of the texts were translated into versions which were not readable at all, perhaps. So you might wish to respond.
As a translator of literary texts, I think in my own interest, I shouldn't find any text untranslatable, because then I'll be out of business. We will try, I think. But I was talking about these knowledge texts which were translated, and they're unreadable. They're not untranslatable. I think most of the translators simply didn't take the trouble of getting these texts read by their potential or their target readers. They were famous professors, established academics, so they simply translated this text and thought that they would be intelligible. They didn't go through the process of editing or process of field testing, something I think I'm told that in NCERT, the textbooks are field tested. They are taught to a group of students and their feedback is taken seriously into account before editing the text. I think these were done in a hurry. So these knowledge texts are translated by specialists, those who know something about that subject, are experts in that subject. But unfortunately, I think they took the task of translation for granted and they took their audience or target readership for granted. And they didn't have enough humility and they didn't work hard. So I don't think they're untranslatable. I'm sure they could better versions of these could be produced through hard work and through sincerity.
Okay, we go on to the next question. Sonali Ganguly has written, sir, you referred to the Viswa Sahitya Parichaya written in Odia. Would you kindly mention its objective? Was it translation of Western perception on world literature, or was it based on the perception of the Odia intelligentsia? It further makes me curious to know about the source. Is the book available?
The book is available, only a few copies. I think we have a copy in our library, but I don't think many copies are available. These books were utterly neglected and nobody read them. Well, this is some kind of a book digest. I think Professor Saubhagya Misra and Professor Ganeshwar Misra, they edited and compiled this book. They just placed summaries. They included summaries of world's classics in this volume, so that a student, a BA student or an undergraduate student will get a general idea of world literature. But as you know, world literature, as we see it in India, is actually Western literature. Most of these writers belong to either America or Britain or maybe a couple of Russian writers. So that's a very good question. But Viswa in 1960s or even today actually means the West for us, unfortunately. I don't think there would be many Chinese or Japanese or Indonesian writers there. So Viswa Parichaya, Viswa Sahitya Parichaya, Viswa Sahitya meant Western literature, largely, broadly speaking, and it was a Eurocentric, but at least there were some 100 texts, the summaries of 100 or 80 very important, well-known Western literary texts. So they would get a general idea. So that would be my answer to your question. Not available easily. We have a couple of copies or just one copy with us.
Thank you, Jatinder. The next question is from Akash Pradhan. He asks, sir, if every knowledge and every text is translated and available in Oriya, in which fields will Orissa be developed and why?
Of course, I mentioned Vinod Kanungo, I think, who was a Gandhian who dropped out of school during the freedom struggle, and he was inspired by Gandhi's idea that Indian languages should be languages of knowledge. So he single-handedly wrote an 80-volume encyclopedia. And this encyclopedia focuses intensely upon making knowledge of science available to ordinary readers. So popularizing science, because that's where I think we generally think we lag behind. So in a developing nation, generally speaking, we think we are lagging behind developed nations because we may have a very rich literary tradition, we may have wonderful literary forms, but when it comes to science and technology, that's why IITs have emerged as new temples of India. So obviously, I think knowledge, psychology, sociology, physics, chemistry, technology, I think all these things should be, all these forms of knowledge should be available so that you will try to transform your own language in such a way that ideas embodied in this text can be explained, can be accessible, made accessible to someone who doesn't know English, or someone who knows English but would like to observe this knowledge through his own mother tongue. Some people have done this, but generally speaking, the translation is more difficult. The translation is more opaque than the original. I think through laziness and through lack of hard work. It's possible because some people have done it. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible, but generally speaking, people do not, the government doesn't, perhaps the state doesn't promote it, and the individuals do not have, they don't have world and enough time, and so they can't do it. So I think scientific knowledge and knowledge of areas in which we are not very rich.
Okay, thank you, Jatinder. A lot of, quite a few very exciting questions have come in. I'm just reading through them one by one.
I'm scared. Okay.
Sajal Yadav has asked, can one think of a semi-English model where both languages are used and can be useful in higher education?
I just spoke my mind. I expressed my views against monolingual education of all kinds. I always think that in Odia department there should also be some teaching of English, and in English department there should be some teaching of a component that would be that would be constituted by an Indian language. So purely monolingual education can be a kind of trap. So all languages should engage with other languages, but their connect with the local world should never be lost sight of. So in department, I think this bilingualism should be promoted in a very nuanced and layered way, so that we learn from all languages, at least a number of languages, at least 2 or 3 languages. Without that, I think even education received through one language, one's mother tongue, can be very impoverished kind of knowledge. So I'm not in favor of one language becoming the. That's why I also am against English being the only conduit through which we receive knowledge. And Kothari Commission suggested another library language like Russian. So I hope that answers his question, that every language should engage some other language. Without that, it dies of loneliness.
Thank you, Jatinder. The next question is from Krishnendu Pal. He writes, it was an excellent presentation, sir. Could you please elaborate on the idea of how knowledge is being understood in terms of what texts require translation and what do not? Where do cultural texts feature here?
Well, when we talk of universities, we are talking about IITs or higher education institutions, we are talking about a bureaucracy. So we are talking about a syllabus, we are talking about courses of studies, prescribed texts, but we shouldn't confine ourselves only to the texts that are prescribed. There should be other agencies, or there should be a concerted attempt at including or bringing into the mainstream of one culture, the text belonging to another. So I can immediately think of one. I will give you an example from Bengal. For instance, there is this famous 4-volume history of science written by J.D. Bernal. 4-volume history of this great Marxist historian of science. And I found that in Bengal there is an English translation. In fact, it's not a kind of, they don't translate the whole book, which is 4 volumes. 1-volume abridged translation of science in history, Itihase Vigyan. So I think organizations, individuals can always choose text that they consider should enrich or broaden the perspective of the next generation or their contemporaries. So this has to be a dialogue. This has to be a continuous dialogue. We cannot say that only these texts should be, only Western texts should be, because by knowledge we always mean Western knowledge. We don't think that it's not possible to generate knowledge in the non-Western context. So we have to also deal with this mental block, that knowledge is generated only in the West and can be accessed only through English. This is as much a provincial attitude as other kinds of provincial attitude. So we have to overcome that provincial attitude by involving individuals and organizations and groups to select texts which speak to us and bring important bodies of knowledge to us. So this cannot be a kind of bureaucratic activity, but in universities this may degenerate into a bureaucratic activity, or IIT.
Thank you. The next question is from Shashwati Shaha. She says, "Thank you very much, sir, for an informative and enriching lecture. Although a major part of your discussion focused on the 20th century, I would like to take you back to the 19th century and ask where you can trace the beginning of the consciousness regarding translation of knowledge text in Oriya. And was it from the very beginning associated with Oriya nationalism? Because in Bangla, it began roughly from the 1840s with the translations of geography and science texts. Also, this is the second part of the question, do you think that the major crisis in translation of knowledge text is noticed in the translation of science textbooks, because terminology poses a major challenge in these cases?
Okay. I think it's not as if English was the only dominant language. We have in history, in the course of history, we have encountered, all Indian languages have encountered dominant languages with whom they had to negotiate. For instance, before the colonization took place, we had Persian as a very dominant language, the language of administration, language of the court. And we, of course, had Sanskrit. But our way of negotiating with these languages was translation, or you could say rewriting, because we don't translate like the Westerners do. We have a very vigorous tradition of rewriting. So in every language, every Indian language, there is a tradition of rewriting the epics, Sanskrit epics, or adapting Persian Arabic texts. But when the British came, I think there was a kind of rupture. We couldn't deal with English simply through translation. It almost threatened our very existence, the existence of many of our languages. And it was backed by immense financial and military power. So in Odisha, I think it began, the translation of knowledge texts began a little later than Bengal for obvious reasons. After 1866, there was this concerted attempt to translate knowledge texts or produce knowledge texts. I gave you the example of Fakir Mohan and Radhanath Rai writing textbooks on arithmetic, on history, on all manner of subjects in the later half of the 19th century. For instance, the first text that Radhanath Rai and Madhusudan Rao introduced into the school curriculum was Prabandhamala. Essay as a form didn't exist in Odisha before. It's a Western literary form. So they introduced this, and in the middle school exam, they had become grown so ambitious. They were so anxious to introduce new kinds of knowledge into. There was a question: compare Ramayana with Iliad for 16-year-old boys and girls. So Prabandhamala introduced the essay, and essay was a vehicle of knowledge. Before that, a student wasted a lot of effort on Sanskrit grammar or Odia grammar and rhetoric. So they introduced bodies of knowledge, knowledge of geography, knowledge of science. Of course, terminology presented a problem, but they did a wonderful job. It's now that we think that terminology is so difficult that we have to read everything in English. Many of these words can be kept intact, kept as they are in the text, and they can simply be written in, and they can be put in brackets in English words. And English has accepted so many foreign words, so we can accept this. Terminology shouldn't present an insuperable problem, because these people also dealt with science, translating science textbooks and geography textbooks and geography and mathematics textbooks. For instance, Jamiti, which we call geometry now, is called Khetra Tattva. So there was this idea of they were deeply engaged with these questions in a way we are not. We are not wrestling with these problems. We think that, well, this word is difficult, this terminology is a problem, I won't. But they kept constantly trying to get around all these terminological problems and came up with some very interesting alternatives. And where we can't find an alternative, we can use the original. What's the harm? I hope. I mean, it's not a very satisfactory answer, but at least I have made a bold attempt.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Shubha Chakraborty Dashgupta. Shubhati
Hello,
writes,
Shubha. Yes, Shubha.
yes. She asks, would you...
Hi. Hello. Okay, you want me to read it out?
Yes,
yes,
you
that would
read
be
it
great.
out.
That would be great.
No, I was just wondering whether, of course, I mean, you've already said that, but I think knowledge was being taken in a very narrow sense by the NTM and certain other ventures.
Yes.
And probably, I wonder, we should think of going beyond the knowledge paradigm as well, also in the context of education, probably. Maybe think of the creative as a paradigm, because it was used, the knowledge paradigm, the word knowledge was being used again and again, as you say,
Yes,
to prove, to sort of for certain particular ends. So, and I think it's very important to sort of look at, probably to somehow move beyond.
Yes, because we define knowledge in a very bureaucratic and very rigid way. So what it's like saying that I am the master of this college, and what I don't know is not knowledge. So the university bureaucracy or IIT bureaucracy or the higher education, they decide that this is knowledge. So we have to, for instance, in the Indian knowledge system, I was looking at the 64 kinds of knowledge, Sausati Kola or whatever. Cooking is a kind of knowledge, but who would accept it these days? So we think we should broaden the scope of knowledge, and there are many kinds of indigenous knowledge, for instance. Why should only what the translation mission only thinks whatever is produced in the West is knowledge? What about our oral testimony? What about our indigenous knowledge that is the tribals produce? For instance, their knowledge of medicinal herbs, their way of coping with the forest, their ways of coping with the climate. So I think we must broaden the definition of, expand the definition of knowledge, and creep out of the kind of silos in which Western obsession with Western knowledge systems have put us. And in the process, I think we can do something creative, and even translators will have a new and more exciting experience. They shouldn't get handcuffed to what they consider knowledge. A particular part of the world consider knowledge, and we can escape the colonial legacy. I think that way we can make a little more progress. And not a very satisfactory answer.
No,
but I think
thank you very much.
Aloud.
I mean, this was...
At least we could include indigenous knowledge. That's what I say.
Thank you very much, Jatin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
The next question is from Amarjit Nayak. He asks, I would love to have your views on the need to have English as a medium of instruction from primary school level to ensure that English education becomes available to all and not just the rich.
I think there is this assumption. I find this assumption very sinister. I think that we already surrender. We already accept that quality education or acquisition of knowledge is possible only through English. I find this highly suspect and a little sinister. Just because the rich acquire their knowledge, whatever knowledge they acquire, I don't know. I'm also a little skeptical about the kind of knowledge they acquire. Just because it's acquired through English, it's knowledge, and because it's acquired through. So if you're talking about employment opportunities, that's a different story. Whether the multinationals will accept someone who hasn't received his knowledge through English, that's another story. But what the rich receive through English is knowledge, and what I receive through Telugu or Odia is not knowledge. I don't think so. And we always, I think, we get carried away by. I think whenever we are talking about English medium education, we are not very rational. We are not taking many things into account. We are not talking about the hierarchy within the English medium schools. That somebody may be taught English or taught everything through English, but he may belong to an English medium school which is treated with utter contempt by an English medium school which is patronized by the filthy rich. So that won't solve our problem. Knowledge has nothing to do with whether you get it through English. And why not bilingualism? Why not multilingualism? What's wrong with bilingual education so that I can get knowledge through many conduits? So I think that's social anxiety, not a very sober assessment of the situation. Social anxiety is not the right way to assess a social situation. The anxiety of a neighbor is not the best way to look at education.
Thank you.
So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Next question is from Jyotirmoy Mishra, who asks, in this modern era, when Indians are so dependent on the English language, are we just talking about a revolution without any action? What actions do you suggest to an English teacher?
I think, are we really so helplessly dependent on English language? For instance, highly anglicized actors go to Bollywood and have to learn Hindi and make a living. Their English doesn't help them make a living. So I don't think this is an exaggerated account of the situation. So that's one thing. And then my advice to an English teacher is to read a lot of books in English and a lot of books in her mother tongue. Be very proficient and very fluent and eloquent in both the languages. I hope they're doing neither. That's the problem.
Okay. Next question is from Shatarupa Misra. You mentioned the reasons why this experiment has failed in Odisha, but the mission of using regional language for knowledge texts at the level of higher education must be carried on. If Hindi has succeeded in carving a niche, we must continue the efforts in other Indian languages too, and hope that the mission would yield the expected results. Okay, it's not a question. It's a
so it's an observation which. Yeah, well, thank you for that helpful comment and encouraging comment.
Right. And the last question we have is from Akash Pradhan. It's actually quite a few questions together. I have attended your seminar held in Sri Sri University, Cuttack. You have said there that translators are applied like spies. How has that happened? And is translation a part of comparative literature? Is comparative literature and translation departments, are they the consequences of the Cold War?
Okay. The first thing is, I said somewhere that translators were spies. In certain contexts, they were. For instance, whenever, not spies, but collaborators. For instance, when the Europeans went to America, they captured a few Red Indians, taught them English, and released them into their own communities, and they became the interpreters between these two communities so that the Red Indians could be defeated. So in that context, translator can be considered a collaborator, a spy, but not in all contexts. So translators can actually build bridges between communities, but in this particular context, the role they played wasn't a very was somewhat sinister. The other thing is that translation in some contexts, I think, in the Cold War context, translation took a particular direction. For instance, the USIS, the USFI, they got many American novels translated into Indian languages. They paid the authors handsomely. Similarly, the USSR also asked many authors to translate Russian texts into. So there was a particular context in which Cold War affected the course of translation. But not always. I mean, Cold War is over. Other kinds of war, very hot wars have taken over, replaced them. So and I think translation itself is a kind of comparative literature, because you are negotiating between two cultures, you are creating one text out of another, and you are dealing with two languages, two cultures. So translation perhaps can enrich comparative literature, but comparative literature can exist without translation. But translation contributes to comparative literature even if it doesn't want to. So I think that's a very flippant answer, but I hope that will do.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of all the questions. That was a brilliant talk as usual, and it leaves us with many trajectories to think about. And that entire background is very useful. Of course, all experiments, whether they are failed or not, are successes in that way. So perhaps they will lead us to fresher paths. We will now have Professor Sujit Kumar Mondal, the head of the Department of Comparative Literature. I will hand over to Sujit to conclude the session. Sujit.
Thank you, Shantanda. I'm extremely sorry for being unable to be present here from the beginning due to some medical urgency. Jyotinda, I'm really sorry. Professor Jyotin Nayak is an old friend of the department, a great scholar. It's a great loss for me, actually, that I was late to join. This is an initiative by the Department of Comparative Literature, Jalpaiguri University, to organize a series of lectures. And thank you, Jyotinda, for delivering this lecture. This is the beginning, and it's a great beginning, I must say. I should also thank to all of you who are present here today. And of course, thanks to Shantanda for organizing this one and the entire series, I think. And the background, there are Tiash and Rindan who are looking after the technical things, I guess, thanks to them also. Shantanda, so that's all, I guess, for today.
Yeah. Thank you, Sujit. So, yeah, thank you. Bye. Rindan, no.
Thank you.
Oh my God, my audio is over.
So we bring this session to an end here. Thank you.
No, they're leaving.
Okay, sorry, Jyotinda. The session is over. Okay, Jyotinda has also left. Okay.